Today, I want to talk about the AI bubble. And the reason why is because I've made mention of it quite a few times recently, but I feel like people don't truly understand what the underlying issue is and what's going on with it. And I think it's very easy to kind of point to what we are witnessing with, okay, there's companies investing in other companies, and then that's essentially ramping up the speculation that we're seeing. But I think this is a more interesting topic that probably needs to be explained a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dive into a video and then give you a little bit better perspective on what is actually creating this and fueling the AI bubble, and why this might have parallels to the dot-com burst.
Nvidia says we are not Enron. And as usual, anytime anyone invokes the name, I am summoned like a spirit to judge what's really going on here. All of the world's biggest companies, with the exception of Apple, have been spending billions, even committing trillions of dollars to an AI.
Just to make a quick joke at the expense of Apple. Of course Apple hasn't. Just look at the current state of Siri. Siri has been a meme since it came out. So, of course, are they going to be investing in AI? Absolutely not. They have no interest in that.
AI-centered build-out, and most of that has benefited, guess who? Nvidia. They have basically become a data center company. You can see right here that recently all their gaming PC revenue, it's basically like an afterthought. It's not relevant.
And that's actually crazy because as someone who games a fair bit myself and usually gets very, very high-end PCs to do it on, that was basically all they were known as before AI started taking off. Right when it did, and it started getting really popular, I was annoyed because it was right as I was buying a new computer. And so their GPU, or graphics processing unit, right, that's what they're using to run a lot of these AIs, mixed with some other components as well. But the GPU were like impossible to find. And I always, every time I buy a new computer, I buy basically whatever all the nicest components that exist at the time. So that way the computer will last me like 5 years, maybe 5, 6, 7, it depends on how long it can get strung out, right? But at a certain point in time, your computer cannot really keep up with the latest cutting edge games anymore. And then that's when I buy a new one. So the last time that I was building one was like right as the AI GPUs were starting to become very hotly, a very hot commodity. And so they were being snatched up by all these companies, so they were almost impossible to find. And so I'm building out this, thousands of dollar computer, like I think it was like $7,000 computer plus, $7,000+ computer. And I'm like, I got lucky that I didn't really have to wait for one, but it was like a conversation of, oh yeah, who has GPUs on hand and will I actually be able to get one for my computer? Because it was the top of the line at the time. And so just pointing to that is what Nvidia was known for, because that's who actually created the GPU card in my computer right now. Is it's an Nvidia card, and that's what they were known for before. So now that, that's such an integral part of what is needed to run AIs, well, okay, now they're known for that, and that's basically what has exploded their stock and why they're so valuable now, is because those GPUs are used for processing in AIs. But it's just funny to me if you actually know the history of, and if you're a gamer, that was the first thing that I always thought of Nvidia as is a gaming graphics card creator. That's what they were known for. So it's just an interesting transition, I think.
When we're thinking about their overall business, they are all in on AI. And in fact, our entire economy is basically all in on AI. Nvidia, along with the hyperscalers, make up a huge portion of not only the US economy, but the entire world's economy. So what happens to them matters, not just to people building AI who care about AI, but to everyone, actually, leading to memes like this, which are kind of true, and the CEO even acknowledged it. During a recent earnings report, which they beat, Jensen Huang said that expectations for Nvidia were sky high and the company was in a no-win position.
And just really quick on that is, if you missed that, I think he puts it back up here in a second, but it's basically Nvidia holding up the entirety of, it was Atlas holding up the world, right? If you know Greek mythology, that's basically what it was, but it's Nvidia is over Atlas, and then the entire global economy is the world. So basically it's the statement that Nvidia is holding up the entire global economy, which it is. And to what was basically being read about the CEO's comments here is, yeah, the expectations are sky high because, again, it's a speculative bubble. That's just the nature of it, is that, people are banking on, okay, these AI companies are basically going to replace all of human productivity, right? Especially in the white collar first, but then as it scales with robots, it'll basically take over all human productivity. Jobs will be completely unnecessary. Or replaced by AI. I'm not even going to say necessary or unnecessary, but completely able to be replaced by AI. So when you are speculating on that, and if that is the promise that is supposedly going to be achieved, then you're capturing the totality of US GDP, or even world GDP as, an end goal, right? After it takes over all US GDP, then you can roll it out globally, and that's what you're essentially seeing. So when you're seeing that is the ultimate promise and that is the end state that they're trying to push towards, well then of course you don't want to get left behind. You want to be able to cash in as much money of that as possible, or on the back of that as possible. And so yes, the sky high expectations that Nvidia is saying that they have, that's absolutely correct, because that is what the speculation is projecting towards. Whether it's realistic or not, whether they can, whether you think they're actually going to get there or not, that's what the investors are saying, okay, this is how much we're willing to put into it because we believe this is what's going to happen. So when you're doing that, of course it's sky high. You have to achieve nothing less than capturing the entire market. And that's a little bit overblown because otherwise their valuation would be even higher. But that is essentially what is stoking that level of investment. And so they are, again, the expectations are sky high. And then, that's what he has to achieve then. And that's how the stock market works. Otherwise, again, it's going to be a tinderbox that's going to set it off, and then the whole thing collapses. And so, yes, he needs to achieve that, but it's almost unrealistic for him to have to do that. I mean, that's an insane amount of product to have to deliver on.
To online chatter saying if we delivered a bad quarter, if we're off by just a hair, if it looked a little bit creaky, the whole world would have fallen apart. There's no question about that, okay? You've seen some of the memes that are on the internet. We're basically holding the planet together, and it's not untrue. And actually,
and that's exactly it too. And that's why, if you have seen recently where like SoftBank pulled out billions of dollars, Peter Thiel pulled out billions of dollars, like when you're seeing these people or companies or whatever pull out money from Nvidia, if they did that and then they missed their projected earnings, right, even a little bit, then that's a doubling down effect. And then that is where, yes, you will see people fleeing that market. Because if they make their numbers, then you go, okay, yes, they did pull out money from Nvidia, but it was exactly what they had stated, where they're just making other investments or whatever their reasoning is. But if you see, these companies and people pulling out money and then they miss their projected earnings, then that's when you see other investors go, whoa, I think they know something. That is why they pulled out their money. And then they're going to, monkey see, monkey do. They're going to follow that trend. They're going to pull their money out, and then everything collapses. And so that is why it is so dangerous. And he's absolutely correct that because everything else in the stock market is falling back down, except for all these companies that are AI related, right? Tech related, all in that field. So they are continuing to go up, but all consumer stocks, everything like that is pulling back. And so if they were to fall, then everything, the tech and AI stocks, if they were to fall, then everything basically crashes down. Because then there's even less consumer sentiment in those consumer stocks. People freak out. And then obviously the tech ones will massively collapse because they are overinflated on that speculation that I was just talking about. And so then everything comes down, and then it is literally a Great Depression level event.
Actually, the AI czar of America, David Sachs, agrees. He says, according to today's Wall Street Journal, AI-related investment accounts for half of GDP growth. A reversal would risk recession. We can't afford to go backwards. In other words, we are all in this boat somehow together. I don't know how or why we're in this boat, but we're all in on AI, whether we like it or not.
I can tell you exactly why. The reason why is because we don't do anything innovative anymore. Like, this is a new technology that is basically the frontier, and there's tech people chasing it. But aside from that, we don't do anything anymore. There's globalization, all of our jobs have been shipped out overseas. So basically the only thing that we do is the cutting edge technologies. And the thing that has been happening over the last decade or so, where it's just financialization of everything, private equity is going into everything, those people are not out creating new innovative things. So it's literally just this AI. And that's what all the hopes are riding on, is this is the only thing that we actually do that is unique. And so this is where all of our hopes are, right? Because a lot of the other things, we don't want to dive too deep into it because I want to stick on the bubble thing. But that is the thing, is like a lot of other technologies China has caught up on. And so in that scenario, well then what are we doing are we able to export? Right? What are we doing that is actually innovative? All of the companies here, it's basically just, all right, find a way to extract the maximum amount of money from people, and we're not going to do anything new or innovative because there's no threat of new products in the US because everyone else was so far behind for such a long amount of time. Now with China creeping up, we still are keeping an artificial cap on that because we put such high tariffs on all of their goods that could be imported here. And I'm thinking specifically along the line of like cars, smartphones, these types of things, or we just outright ban them like cell phones, right? But okay, we're holding them at bay. So we're keeping out any sort of innovation from US companies because otherwise Chinese goods would come in and absolutely destroy our market because A, they've caught up or surpassed us in a lot of areas, but then B, also because they have artificially deflated their currency, they can make all these items for much cheaper. So then when they go to sell them, it's like, okay, do you want to buy a $50,000 car or do you want to buy a better car for $10,000, $12,000? I mean, what kind of choice is that actually? There's absolutely none. You would 100% buy the Chinese car, at least like 99.999% of Americans would. And so that is the big problem. So all of our hopes and dreams are basically tied up into AI, where there is still innovation to be had because it's such a new field, and the promise of what is the amount of productivity that can be captured with this tool is so much greater than anything else. So that is where all of the money and the hopes are all tied up into that, because once again, everyone has just went into finance, which is not creating anything new. It's not creating anything novel. It's not creating anything useful. It's literally just pinching money out of people and doing nothing productive or helpful for the entirety of humanity. And so, yeah, that is why we find ourselves, to answer his question, that is why we find ourselves in the situation that we do, where we're all just in the same boat with AI and hoping that it works out. And oh, by the way, even if it does work out, you still might lose your job and be in a very dire situation anyway. So lose-lose, I guess.
Whether you like AI, Sora, slop, your 401k is all in. And this is citing a Wall Street Journal article saying how the US economy became hooked on AI spending because all of these capital expenditures have been massively profitable for Nvidia and to a lesser extent, these tech companies, which haven't been making a ton of money from the AI yet compared with their expenses, but have benefited from huge boosts in their stock prices because they're seen as being the future of the future, the AI basically. And furthering the idea that we're just all in on this one thing, I want to mention that Trump recently signed an executive order launching an AI initiative being compared to the Manhattan Project called the Genesis Mission. This is from the White House. They talk about the Genesis Mission building an integrated AI platform to harness federal scientific data sets, and specifically you can see they are partnered with all the leading companies, Google, Nvidia, Anthropic, AMD, Microsoft, AWS. This is all the table stakes we're dealing with. You have to know that AI, and specifically Nvidia, is a gigantic part of our economy, and our White House acknowledges that it's basically the only thing keeping us from a recession right now. With most people feeling like they already are in a recession because of their earnings being stagnant and because of inflation ripping. But I want to talk about...
And that's what I've constantly been saying is that, yes, I think we are in a recession, but because of this AI bubble, it's basically keeping that top line number of the stock market high. And so Trump just looks at that and goes, oh yeah, we're the best, the best. And Biden did it too during his tenure. Oh yeah, it's the best stock market we've ever seen. Meanwhile, okay, no, that's not actually... We're not in the best economy. People are not doing the best they've ever done. Things are getting worse and worse and worse. But because of this bubble, well, okay, sure. I guess you can look at the stock market. But if you look at literally any other indicator, like foreclosures, like auto repossessions, like the amount of debt that people have per household, like there are tons and tons and tons of other indicators that say that, yes, we are in a recession. But they just like to prop up the one that looks moderately decent, right? And that's not even if you're looking, that's just if you're looking at the top line number. But if you actually dive into how is everything else doing, it's all on a downward slide.
Nvidia's response, because obviously that sets the stage for the "we are not Enron" claim, because there have been questions boiling up about all of this investment. Is it worth it? Is anyone doing anything suspicious? So we saw Nvidia sent a report to certain outlets basically fighting back on the FUD. And two of their source documents were a guy on X, aka Michael Burry, the guy from The Big Short, who's recently been criticizing them, and another article which said the algorithm that detected a $610 billion fraud, how machine intelligence...
And if you don't know who that is or what The Big Short is, basically, he predicted the Dotcom bubble burst and made millions and millions and millions of dollars off of it. So that is why when you're looking at, okay, who is he? What is the context? Why is this important? He projected that burst, that bubble burst, and he's saying that this is going to happen here as well. And just a caveat in that, he's also had, in between then and now, he's had a bunch of other predictions that haven't worked out, and he's actually admitted that himself as well. But in this situation, I think he is 100% correct that this is a giant bubble. And as I said at the intro, the reason why I want to cover it is because he actually lays out, okay, it actually has more to do with, because there's the meme of that whole, the big circle of, okay, there's investment going here, and Nvidia's in the middle, and ChatGPT, and so there's stuff flowing in and out, and okay, yes, it's a bubble, but he actually lays out the most interesting argument for it, which is the infrastructure build out, which is what we're seeing with all the data centers. And so and I'll let him get into it and continue on the way. But that was an interesting parallel between the dot-com burst and now.
Expose the AI industry's circular financing scheme. Now, I want to specifically talk about Michael Burry because he's the main thing they're responding to. He has been kind of shaking up the industry with an interesting critique that I don't think a lot of people have focused on. So far, a lot of the criticism about AI bubbles has been that AI is not as impactful as we thought, or that it is being overhyped. But Michael Burry comes to it from a very different angle. And I want to talk about his Substack articles he's been putting out. He's recently become a blogger, a bit of an influencer recently after he shut down his hedge fund. And so now he can publicly comment on these types of issues. Now, I'll obviously link below to his articles, but understand they are paid. I think it's like $390 for the year. So I bought it for you, so you don't have to. I'm going to be talking about it. But
here's the other thing, too, that's interesting about him is that his hedge fund, before he shut it down, he basically put a ton of put options. So basically he bought the stocks as they are now, and he bought the right to sell them back later at a lower cost. So that's basically he's selling them now. He's not buying them now, but he's selling them now for the opportunity to buy them later. And so what you're basically saying when you're purchasing these put options, right? When you're selling these put options, is you're saying, I think that the stock is going to go down. I think that I'm going to buy it, or I'm going to sell it now. It's worth X amount of money, and it's going to go down, and I'm going to make a bunch of money because I'm going to buy it at a later point in time. So whatever the difference is, well, then I've made that much money. But they can be very dangerous because if it goes off on a run the other way, then literally all of your money can completely disappear. So the thing is with that is he basically got all these put options to say that, okay, the stock is going to go down, and his time frame was basically, I believe, the end of 2027. So he thinks 2026, whatever, and then 2027, by 2027, all of these companies, their stocks will not completely disappear, right? That's not what he's saying, but he thinks they're going to be worth massively less than what they're worth now, which, again, if you think this is a bubble and you think it's going to pop, then 100% that is exactly what you're going to be seeing, and buy that in that time frame. But these were the positions that he took with his investment company before he shut it down. Like literally right before. He did that, and then he put out a public statement and walked away basically, just to let it play out. So I think he's completely leveraged on this being what happens.
let me just say, he's a great writer. I'm not going to feature much of it because obviously it's paywalled stuff, but I just want to give you the basic arguments so we can talk about the implication of what Nvidia is really so worried about. So the first thing Michael Burry lays out is a primer on the dot-com bubble, which he calls a supply-side gluttony. And the main thing he lays out is the idea that the original dot-com bubble from 1999, 2000 that everyone remembers is sort of misremembered. It's sort of like one of these Mandela effect things where everyone's collective memory is not quite what really happened. If you ask your average person, if you ask even me what the dot-com bubble was about, I'd probably mention something like pets.com, some of these dot-com businesses that had no revenues and basically were complete vaporware that were trading at massive valuations that didn't support anything. And this is what the AI...
And that's how basically everyone explains it, right? Same thing, yes, Mandela effect, because it like if you hear other people talk about it, they're literally like, oh yeah, these companies just saw if you put .com at the end of anything, the valuation goes up an insane amount for literally no reason. And that's how everyone explains it. So once again, the reason why I'm covering it is because this is a much deeper, because he bet on it, right? He called it out before it happened. So he can actually explain the nuts and bolts of, okay, what actually happened? What did I see that made me identify correctly that it was a bubble? So he's like best positioned, in my opinion, to actually tell you what occurred and what is mirrored in this current bubble.
Defenders say when you bring up the dot-com bubble, the massive amounts of spending, they might quote someone like Jerome Powell, who says that unlike the dot-com bubble, AI spending isn't a bubble. Quote, I won't go into particular names, but they actually have earnings. The idea being that back in the pets.com days, the Ask Jeeves days, there wasn't actual revenues to support the valuations. Unlike here, you actually have companies like Google who are making tons of money. So it's just kind of not the same thing.
But the other thing too is that actually, and he called it out earlier in this video. But even these companies, the AI companies right now, don't have revenue to support the investment. That's the entire point of this. So like, yes, we're going to get into the infrastructure component of it, but even just on the baseline of, okay, what's being claimed during the dot-com bubble, they didn't have revenues to support the valuation. The exact same thing is happening here. Because again, the speculation is that you're going to capture all of humanity, all of the US's productivity, right? So you're going to capture all the GDP basically. But that, again, that's the speculation. You're not doing that now. You're not close to that yet. Like, that's still a little bit away, in my opinion. So when you're seeing that, it's like, okay, yes, but you literally can't say anything different from, that's an exact mirror to what's going on right now. Because yes, these companies are making, in ChatGPT's instance, yes, okay, they're making $20 billion a year, but like your valuation of that is like $1 trillion. And so it's way higher than what they're actually achieving. And so when you are seeing that, it's literally apples to apples. It's the exact same thing. And so when you're saying the valuation isn't being met by the revenue, it's the exact same thing. So it's kind of silly for him to make any sort of statement like that. I think there would be more apt descriptions that could be laid out or criticisms, but whatever. Again, a lot of these people are just propagandists. They're not actually intelligent. So we'll just go along with whatever they're saying, I guess.
And Michael Burry argues that that's actually not true, that the dot-com bubble was a lot more about overbuilt infrastructure from companies that were profitable. Specifically, he brings up Cisco Systems, which was one of the most valuable companies in the year 2000, and specifically was valued based on a lot of their interconnecting equipment sales for the internet, the future, basically. And a lot of the narrative at the time was that the internet is the future, so you have to invest massively in infrastructure for the future. And because of that, there was a massive overbuild. And that all blew up when there...
And just imagine that in today's terms. As he is saying, it's building up the infrastructure. So we're building up data centers for the future because that is the future. That's, again, literally a parallel, 1-to-1 with what's going on right now. So just calling that out, because I think that is hugely true. And if at any point in time we discover, okay, hey, we found a way to process data much more efficiently, so we don't need, we can cut the amount of compute needed in half, or whatever the increase in productivity eventually ends up being, right? So we don't need half these data centers. Think about what happens to all that infrastructure? What happens to all those buildings? What happens to all that compute, right? What happens to all those GPUs? What happens to all those servers? What happens to all this stuff that has been built out as they need these mega data centers that are just huge, just absolutely gigantic? And then what do they turn into? So you're going to be sitting on all these, all this corporate real estate. You're going to be sitting on all this outdated, and this is the other thing too, is like outdated GPU units. These things turn over incredibly quickly. Like after I built my computer, right, my top of the line computer, like a year later, a new GPU came out, and now mine is, yes, it was top of the line at the time, but now it's as good as like their second or third best GPU. Like it's not anywhere near the top anymore. And so, again, these things turn over very quickly, and especially with all of the upward pressure of we need to build out better and better chips to fuel these AI systems and be able to continue improving upon them. So now there's even more incentive for, okay, hey, we need to create and ship new chips. And so that is exactly the problem, is that you're building out all this infrastructure that can literally be used for nothing else. So even if you do achieve, although, I'll say, even if you achieve an improvement, you could still run into, okay, they have all this, these liabilities that are sitting on their asset sheets, right, on their balance sheets. And so that could cause a bubble to pop. So this is exactly why it's so interesting and such a good thing to call out, is because that infrastructure investment at any point in time that could collapse. And especially if AI totally washes out and it's not worth the amount of, electricity that's being put into these systems, or water consumption, or whatever it is, right? If there's any sort of falling short, then that's why all this could blow up, is because the amount of money that's being put into infrastructure is absolutely gigantic.
What just wasn't the demand to meet the supply, and everyone had found out that they had overspent on a bunch of infrastructure that wasn't going to be used. So Burry says, hey, look, these .com companies that everyone likes to cite, they weren't big companies, big players in the game. The biggest players who were leading the large cap did have revenues. It was just all based on an overspend on infrastructure. And he argues the same thing is happening with AI. I should also mention there's a lot of talk about the WorldCom scandal, which is basically a telecommunication company. And their big thing was essentially accounting fraud. They basically moved line items from the expenses category to the assets and made it seem like they were more profitable than they were. Okay, so to zoom out, what does this all have to do with Nvidia, right? Why are we talking about the .com bubble? Well, Michael Burry is basically making a two-pronged case so far, which is one, that there's a ton of overbuilding on supply, just like there was for the early internet, that's not necessarily tied to any revenues, and that's going to become a huge problem. And secondly, he thinks there are some accounting tricks that are happening that is based.
And just real quick before we get to that, yes, because, and this is the thing too, is that in the US, there's such an aversion to actually building up infrastructure. And so that is why, okay, when you're seeing this kind of a thing where we're saying they're not seeing a return on revenue because they're having to build out these data centers to actually achieve, or hopefully achieve, the promise of AI, that's where it gets kind of scary for investors, because once again, then if you fall short, then that's where you're going to see a giant crash. And so, yes, that is kind of harrowing for these companies to have to buy into the promise of this is where AI is going. So just want to call that out as well, is that in the US, any sort of financial company is very adverse to anything that's not going to see immediate returns in revenue. Once again, it's speculation on the future returns, but when you're having to build out data centers and all this kind of stuff that's not going to see an immediate return, that's where you could see some big issues in the model that we have essentially stood up over the last decade or so.
Basically overstating revenues.
And just really quick, it's overstating earnings and assets. He has that up behind me. So you can't see it there. He just misspoke here. But yeah, it's basically the companies are overstating their earnings and assets.
And this is in his next post called Unicorns and Cockroaches, Blessed Fraud. This is where he takes a deep look on the depreciation of GPUs. Now, GPUs are basically...
And if you look here, because I just want to pull it up because this graph is actually very important. As I was saying when I was talking about my computer, right? This is the important thing to think about. So as you're building out a computer, right? You basically assume that, okay, when I build it, like I said, I keep mine for usually somewhere between 5 to 7 years. And then that's typically when, okay, I'm no longer able to play the cutting edge games and my GPU is basically trash at that point in time, right? There's been usually two new releases of new GPU cards. And so that's when I just go, all right, just everything has increased at such a rate that I just need to essentially buy an entirely new computer. And that's just, instead of trying to catch up one component at a time, I just do it all at once. That's just how I like to do things. But that is the point, is when you're trying to build something with the cutting edge technology, you need to keep up on the newest one every single time. So by basically extending out, by saying, okay, these GPUs are not fully depreciated until 6 years, well, that's complete BS. That's not the actuality of what's going on here. They're only going to last at most 3 years. So when you're seeing on this graph, it's saying, okay, Amazon AWS is saying that the depreciation is 3 years, and this is at the beginning in 2017. That is an accurate reflection. 4 years is a bit on the long side. So when you're seeing Google Cloud or Microsoft Azure, when you're saying them say 4 years, like even that is a little bit aggressive. But what's happening is basically they're saying that the depreciation goes on for longer. So every time they buy a card, it's not fully depreciated until the very end. So what they can do is they can continue writing off those cards, even though at some point in time, they're actually completely worthless, right? At 3 years, they're probably all completely worthless, and they need to go out and buy new ones. And so, but by depreciating it out, by, lengthening that depreciation time out to 6 years, well, then they can continue writing them off over that amount of time, and then it overstates their earnings. So they're not basically taking that depreciation over a shorter amount of time, and it just looks better on their balance sheets. So they're not having to justify, okay, why are you losing so much money so quickly? Why is this product hemorrhaging so much money? They don't have to answer questions on that because it looks like, okay, you can justify it as they're still building it out. We know the AI is kind of a longer term game, and so we're okay with what we're seeing in terms of money lost, right? They're not losing money as quickly as if they left it in as a 3-year depreciation.
GPUs. Now, GPUs are basically the lifeblood of Nvidia. This is what they're selling primarily to these data centers. This is what's doing a lot of the AI compute. And recently, there has been an accounting change in how these things are depreciated. Basically, several of the major companies have been shifting their depreciation costs on GPUs from 3 years to about 6 years, or 4 years to 6 years. And this basically has the effect of increasing stated earnings because you are depreciating slower. So if you lengthen the amount of time that you can depreciate something over, your earnings during those years are going to increase. And the problem, of course, is if the actual life cycle of the thing is not as long as your depreciation schedule says it is, because it will make investors think you have assets that really aren't assets, basically. Now, I should say, not everyone agrees this is a mistake. Some people say that there's a justification for this, that several of these old chips are actually being used in what's called inference for these AI models. But today I wanted to...
That makes some sense, right? Because the argument is, okay, if you think about older models or flash models or whatever, right? If you think about if you're using the free product for any of the AI, especially the top level ones, where you get a certain amount of prompts per day and then it kicks you off to the lower level, right? Like a flash or like a, whatever they call it, light or whatever, older model, any of those types of things. Yes, those can still utilize some of those older GPUs, but the thing is they're just building they're not using any of these GPUs in these stronger, faster, high-end models. So again, I think it's just very disingenuous that they're doing this because yes, the liabilities, when you're putting it on an asset versus liability, they're taking in this revenue, but then if they had way more liabilities on their sheet, because they are basically useless GPUs. Like if you don't think, because it's an arms race, if you don't think they're actually replacing all these GPUs before the 6-year mark and basically throwing out all of the old ones, you're out of your mind. You have no idea how this stuff actually works. They are 100% replacing everything because it is such an arms race and everyone wants to win this war. They're replacing all their GPUs as soon as they can. And so that is the thing along with this, and that's why it 100% is a bubble, and that the depreciation, the infrastructure parallels to the dot-com bubble are 100%. It's 1-to-1. It is exactly, it's way more build out and infrastructure liabilities on their books than they should have. And it's all to basically make the numbers look better in the moment.
Take a look at that, because that is where I think Burry's arguments cut the most true. I don't see why we think GPU life cycles are going to be longer instead of shorter in today's age. I don't think there's any evidence for that. And that leads to Michael Burry's whole argument. He says, responding to Nvidia's claim that they are not Enron, quote, "I am not claiming that Nvidia is Enron. It's clearly Cisco." And this is...
And here's the thing, is that the chips aren't going to be good for longer. These GPUs are not going to be good for longer, because that is part of the promise of AI, is that, okay, if you are getting better and better AI, then it will be able to improve on its own infrastructure as well. It will be able to help you come up with specs for better chips faster and faster and more and be able to improve on itself. That's just part of the promise of AI. And so if that is the fact, well, then it's going to have runaway improvements that are going to be way better than anything that we've come up with. And on a time scale, much faster, because you're going to integrate those improvements and then it's going to come up with better improvements. And then it comes up, and then you integrate those and then it comes up with better improvements. And it's going to be a faster and faster and faster time scale that these things happen. So if anything, if AI is accomplished, AGI, ASI, if that is achieved, then 3 years is even going to be on the long side. And so, yeah, that's where it just, again, the time scale on these, if anything, 3 is the long side. So them lengthening it to 6 is very shady and underhanded, in my opinion.
Obviously referencing the idea that the criticism here is that this is an infrastructure overbuild out. All this commitment for massive data centers, the likes of which we've never seen, before there is revenues to support it for the hyperscalers like Google, Amazon, Microsoft. It just doesn't make sense. And that's his argument. It's not a question of whether AI is real or not. It's just a question of, do you need this before there is demand for it? But now we're going to dive deep into this criticism of depreciation. Basically, these GPUs are not valuable past a few years, or are they valuable for 6 years? Because Nvidia said in their whole response to Michael Burry and the haters, they said, rebutting this claim, some companies have increased useful life estimates to reflect the fact that GPUs remain useful and profitable for longer than originally anticipated, in many cases for 6 years or more. But this, even for me, rang very hollow, because I've seen podcasts where the CEO of Nvidia is talking about how they're not slowing down the pace of development, they're actually accelerating it, and they're actually introducing an annual cycle for putting out new chips now, which is faster than ever before. So if anything, the pace at which your GPUs will become outdated is not slower than before. It's actually arguably faster than before.
So the first thing is, because the token generation rate is going up so incredibly, 2 exponentials on top of each other, we have to, unless we increase the performance at incredible rates, the cost of token generation will keep growing, because Moore's law is dead, right? Because transistors basically cost the same every single year now. And power is largely the same. And between those 2 fundamental laws, unless we come up with new technologies to drive the cost down, even if there's a slight difference in growth, you give somebody a discount of a few percent, how's that going to make up for 2 exponentials? And so we have to increase our performance annually at a pace that keeps up with that exponential.
Now I want to pause here, because basically what he's saying is we are accelerating in order to keep pace with the demand. But this acceleration also means that if you previously, your GPU would sort of become irrelevant in several years, it's actually going to become irrelevant even faster now. And you can kind of see here how the performance.
And that's exactly what I was calling out, where I was basically saying, oh yeah, the problem is that there's all this pressure from these AI companies. It's an arms race. So of course that's going to speed up. It's not going to slow down. That's going to speed up the rate at which these new chips are having to come out. These new GPUs are having to be created. What the cutting edge looks like. There's much more pressure from the promise of AI, which everyone, again, we're all in that boat, hoping that we achieve it and that we are the ones that capture all of the productivity. So in that instance, then, of course it's going to speed up. Because before they were only having to meet the need of, okay, where do we turn over the entire market? What's the time frame where we can introduce? Because when you're just making components for gaming, gamers, well then, all right, what is the market saturation? When can we release a new one? When can these games actually take advantage of these new chips that we're putting out? It's a totally different ecosystem. It's a totally different economy. But now it's, okay, we need the cutting edge immediately. As soon as we can get it, we need it over and over and over. We need it, we need a new one. We need our models to be, doing more and more and more. You need, exactly what you're saying, you need one every single year. And when that is the case, well, this is what you basically get. is that, yeah, you're gonna come out with them every year. I mean, it's literally just common sense.
Of some of their products has increased over time and decreased the amount of energy you need to generate a token. And that's going to become really relevant because, as you'll see, part of the problem for these data centers is the cost per watt. Basically, the electricity cost fundamentally is what you're pushing against. And so as these GPUs get more powerful or get more efficient per watt, then you're going to have to replace it. Otherwise, you're just not competitive with the general marketplace. And alongside that, now we can listen to Jensen explain why this performance increase eventually means that other people's GPUs are literally not worth running because they're so much less efficient than these new models or new GPUs.
Some people where you say, our competitors building ASICs, they could literally, all their chips are cheaper already today, but they could literally price them at zero. Our objective is they could price them at zero, and you would still buy an Nvidia system because the total cost of operating that system, power, data center, land, etc., the intelligence out is still a better bet than buying
because
a chip, even if it's given to you for free.
Because the land, power, and shell is already $15 billion.
Right. Yeah.
Let's just think about it from a perspective of revenues.
Yes.
Okay. So everybody's power limited. And let's say you were able to secure 2 more gigawatts of power. Mm. Well, that 2 gigawatts of power, you would like to have translate to revenues.
Yes.
So your performance or tokens per watt was twice as high as somebody else's token per watt.
And this is where I'm very sympathetic to Burry's argument, where Nvidia sort of wants to have it both ways.
Here's the thing along with that is that, yes, of course it's pushing up against the power because our grid, again, in the US, no one likes to actually invest in infrastructure. So what's happening is we are running in a lot of places at essentially shoestring level, right? So you're literally, okay, here's the maximum amount of power that can be in the grid at one time or can be drawn on. And okay, we're running right up, there's not a lot of flexibility in how much is available outside of what is being used. And that's how you see things like in that huge blizzard where something came out and they're like, oh yeah, we were literally minutes away from the entire grid collapsing when they had that huge snowstorm a couple of years ago, is because that's it, is they didn't have additional infrastructure built out. They said, okay, nothing like this ever happens here. We know exactly how much is needed. So when a freak snowstorm occurs and they push up, the amount of power that they need, and if they go past what that is, the entire grid is going to be destroyed. And then there's no power for anyone. And so that is what is happening. And they were shuttering people's thermostats, and they were doing all sorts of stuff. Like if you had a smart thermostat, they were actually shutting off people's heat because they were running up. They were going to destroy the entire grid. And so that is exactly it, is there is not enough power in the United States. And so that's what they're running up against. And that's why they have to come up with chips that are more, and that's why they're so valuable, is because then, okay, you can build out these giant data centers and you're going to use less power. And so that, again, that's just laying the groundwork and helping you understand why the compute per wattage is so important.
Want to have a long lifespan for their products, but they also want an insane annual cycle pace, which is accelerating ever faster. And literally they're saying, look, you can't even buy our competitors' chips because performance per watt, it's not even worth running them. But you can also say if they keep increasing the pace of their development this fast, then they're actually cutting against what? Their old chips too. It's not just their competitors' chips, it's their own chips are not worth running. And so that's the whole argument for this depreciation cycle not making sense. And if it doesn't make sense, what happens to everyone's earnings? All these hyperscalers, well, they would be overstated. They actually aren't what they thought, and they are much lower, which would mean that their market price would go down. So ironically, Nvidia is sort of cutting off the very tree that they're standing on in part because they are making their chips less useful faster because of their development pace.
Well, I mean, they have to. But here's the other side of that argument, too, is that actually increases their valuation, though, right? Like, it would decrease everyone who's using their chips, right? There would be a downward effect on all of them, anyone who's buying their chips to run their AIs. So like a Grok, like a OpenAI, like, any of these companies, right? So all of theirs would be devalued, but then Nvidia's would go up because every single year, if they're coming out with a new chip every single year, all of these companies have to buy a new chip every single year. That's just what it has to be. So yes, it is devaluing the other companies, which still could have a giant impact on that, but it would still keep theirs sky high, their valuation, because they're still selling chips and new chips every single year.
Now, the question, of course, is, well, can they slow down? Not really, because Google is right on their heels with Gemini 3, which they supposedly developed with just their in-house TPUs, which, funny enough, the Nvidia newsroom actually commented on, saying, "We are delighted by Google's success. They have made great advances in AI, and we continue to supply to Google. Nvidia is a generation ahead of the industry. It's the only platform that runs every model and does it everywhere computing is done." But within this, a lot of people sensed a cope. They were trying to just kind of reassure everybody, hey guys, we're still the best, right? But the question is, are they going to be the best forever? And so they really can't stop the pace, which ironically is going to hurt their customers who have to constantly cycle through these chips in order to be competitive with the rest of the industry. I should also notice that there are also cheaper open source Chinese models that are getting quite good. There's something called Kimi K2. And the question ultimately is not whether AI is a thing, at least not according to Michael Burry, but rather whether Nvidia is worth all this capital expenditure, whether it makes sense, whether they are overbuilding, whether a company that is primarily valued on their data center revenue, whether those data centers are going to make money. Because if it doesn't, basically our entire economy is built on this. It's built on this giant scale up. And even our government officials acknowledge that and say, we can't afford to go backwards. In others, we sort of can't afford this not to work out. And yeah, that's basically the story of Nvidia. Actually, I do have to admit, I agree with them. They're not Enron, ultimately, after looking at the evidence, but maybe they are Cisco, maybe a little bit, or maybe not at all. I don't know.
I think they could be Cisco, because the thing is, and especially, I think the most important thing that probably should spend a little bit more time on there was the fact that there are companies that are building out their own chips. And yes, Gemini 3 just came out. It is, I think, the best model out right now. When you're seeing stuff like that happen and you're seeing success of companies who are using their own proprietary chips, like Gemini, like Llama, right, from Meta, although I would say Meta's probably a little bit behind the top three, right? Top four, maybe, if you want to include Claude because of their coding success, right? They're probably the top in coding, but then you have Gemini, you have Grok, you have OpenAI. So those are like probably the top three, and then Llama's is probably like Claude is a little bit below, and then Llama below that. So when you're seeing that hierarchy, though, and you're starting to see companies with their own chips becoming the leader, well, then that could very easily usurp NVIDIA's value. That's where you could see, okay, now XAI is going to start trying to, I think it was mentioned that they were going to start trying to create their own chips, but I think they're probably a little bit further away. Maybe OpenAI says, hey, let's try and duplicate that success as well. Maybe we start building out our own chips, especially if it's seen that there is a competitive advantage where, okay, Google's chips, they actually use even less power, or whatever the situation is. Whatever it is, if it basically spawns copycats in that area, and then people don't need the NVIDIA chips as much, or they need less of them, or whatever that situation looks like, then yes, they are very much posed to be in a Cisco situation where they're churning out all these chips and then no one really needs them anymore. Then that becomes a very big problem. Right now, I don't think that's exactly what's going on, but again, there is a future state where if Google continues to have success, or if Llama makes a huge leap or something like that with their own proprietary chips, then everyone else might copycat that design.
Ultimately, I'm a YouTuber, but I am compelled by the idea that the depreciation on these chips, if Nvidia is able to accelerate their development of chips as fast as they say, I think this whole 6-year thing really doesn't make sense at all. Now, the effect that might be having, whether that's significant enough to really matter, whether the AI takeoff is going to be as revolutionary as they say, I'm not really going to give my opinion here. I thought it was just interesting to look at. Even if you agree with Michael Burry, that's not necessarily a reason to try to make some kind of prediction based on the markets. You never know when the markets are going to change. They can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. And just in general, it's a bad idea to time the market. So I do not recommend you make financial trades based on any of this. It's just a look at what's happening in our world in an industry that's going to affect all of us.
All right, and that was basically what I wanted to cover with the AI bubble. I think it is a very interesting look and something that I don't think is really covered as much. I haven't even really dug into it. So that is why I wanted to, because I talk about it a fair amount, because I think it is something that is affecting the market and something to be aware of. As he said, though, it's definitely not investing advice. It is just my take on what I think is going to happen and the timelines associated with it. That's what makes the most sense to me. But at the end of the day, I could be completely incorrect. So again, be wary. It doesn't matter how many things I say, yes, I was correct on that. You're never going to have 100% accuracy on all of the things that you predict. But again, thought it was very interesting to take a look at it, see, okay, what is the actual problem? Why is it actually being called a bubble? And, you know, what's going on with it? Here's what I see going on. Here's what other people in the space are saying. And then, you know, you can make your own inferences on what you think is happening with, is there a bubble? Do you think it's going to pop? Do you think that it continues on and achieves ASI, AGI? I'm actually kind of in that camp that it 100% could, but at any point in time, the bubble could burst and there still could be someone who goes on to achieve it. So it's not even saying that those two things are completely mutually exclusive. Both of those things could still occur at the same time, and we'll just have to see what happens. But if you like the video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more content from me like this, drop me a subscription below. It really does help my channel grow. And if you have made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.